In the name of God, this is session 2 of your morphology lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about the morphology, the definition of morpheme, the morph, allomorph, and I talked about the new words, how we can produce new words in our languages, and how we can understand them. And then I talked about some abstract notions in morphology, which we, as native speaker of a language, knows them, but we do not think about them. Just we use them as the abstract notions in our morphology, and you see there are some differences between the English language and some other languages. For example, the number, dual number or trial number, or the other parameters in languages. In this session, I want to talk about the background and some beliefs. This book is a general introduction to morphology and morphological analysis from the point of view of a morphologist. The purpose is not to advocate any particular theory or to give the truth, but rather to get you, the reader, to where you can look for it by yourself. Still, it is inevitable that some of our remarks will be colored by our own beliefs and background. We would therefore like to present some of our foundational beliefs about linguistics and linguistic methodology. The first approach at the first belief and background which I want to talk about is we believe that languages differ from one another. You might be thinking, of course they do, but we mean this in a very special way. Some linguists are always looking for ways that languages are similar, and at times we do that too. But we believe that if you focus only on the similarities between languages, you miss out on all of the the exciting, ways in which they differ. What's more, you may find parallels and similarities where none really exist. We try to approach linguistic analysis with as open a mind as possible, and to do this, it is first necessary to appreciate the uniqueness and diversity of the world's languages. So this is the first background of beliefs which we believe in this book, that languages differ from one another. Okay, so we show the differences in some aspects in the previous session, as I told you about the number, about the plural form, and some other phenomena. The second, our second, foundational belief is that languages, with the little l, which we can write with a small, l, are different from language with a capital L. You see here, we use two kind of language in this book. The first one with a small l, and the second one with the capital L. There are thousands of individual languages in the world, okay? But we may also speak of language in general to mean the general phenomena of language that encompasses all individual languages. This language is related to Noam Chomsky's notion of universal grammar, the capital L, which posits that all languages are alike in basic ways. Each of these two uses of the word language is equally important to linguistics. Individual languages have features that are not characteristics of language in general, capital L. For example, one feature of English is that its regular way of forming plural noun is to add Z. We would never claim, however, that this is universally true, or that it is a property of language with capital L, in language in general. To tie this belief in with the preceding one, we strongly believe that morphological theory and morphological analysis must be grounded in morphological description if we want to appreciate what morphology really is, it's best to have some idea of what the morphology of individual languages is like. At the same time, we must have a reasonably well thought out general theory of the morphology of language, I mean big language and capital language, so that we can compare our description of individual languages within a wider context. In short, linguists need to pay equal attention to both small L language and capital L, I mean language. This is so the second belief which we believe in this book. The third belief, our next belief, I mean, is that morphology is a distinct component of languages or grammars. You know, if you are not already familiar with some of the controversies surrounding morphology, this needs an explanation. The fact that some languages, such as, for example, Vietnamese or Chinese, do not have morphologically complex words, has led some people to conclude that morphology should not be a separate branch of linguistics. The reasoning is that linguistics is generally understood to deal with properties of language, I mean big language, capital L. If there are languages that do not have morphology, then morphology is not a property of all languages and of language. And morphological phenomena should be treated in syntax or phonology. We disagree, okay, with this belief. It has been shown elsewhere in some other, linguistics work like Aronov, that some aspects of morphology cannot be attributed to syntax or phonology or anything else. One piece of evidence that morphology is separated from syntax, phonology, and other branches of linguistics is that words in some languages are grouped into largely arbitrary classes, for example, that determine their forms in different environments. So just with morphology we can explain these groups of words, not with syntax and not with phonology. So this is the third belief, which the morphology is a distinct component of languages or grammars. So, and it's, separated from phonology and syntax. The first one, we also believe that morphologies are systems. This is a very old observation. Because of it, it is impossible to talk about, isolated facts in a language. Everything holds together. This belief, together with the second one above, are the reasons why we'll be looking carefully at the morphology of a particular language. For example, we study particular language like the Quadmodular language in this book. So this is because we believe that morphologies are systems. All of languages, have morphologies as a complicated system. So so far we have given you our beliefs in these four beliefs about the nature of language and morphology. We also have some that pertain to methodology. The first is that, so the first belief about the methodology of the morphology is that we should take an attitude of a skeptical realism. What does this mean? Albert Einstein said that a physicist must be both a realist and a nominalist. A realist in the sense that you must believe what you ultimately find will, excuse me. Will be real, but a nominalist in the sense that you must never believe you have found what you are looking for. Martin Jewes made a similar statement about linguistics. On the one hand, you should always believe that what we are looking for is God's truth, but on the other, you should consider all that you have found so far as, for example, hocus pocus, nothing. We believe strongly in the value of having a linguistic theory, but we believe equally strongly that you should never trust it completely. This is the methodology related to, morphology. Our other methodological belief can be summed up as a motto: anything goes. What this means? This methodological belief is associated with the uh, 20th century philosophers. Okay, this says that people who are wedded to individual theories tend to believe in using tools that are rooted in that theory. Our tools are not theory based in that way. If a tool does the job, we are happy to use it. Whether it is a traditional linguistic tool, for example, native speaker consultant, dictionary, written grammar, or an experimental tool like imaging technology or a statistical tool. Any tools that can help us to to give the conclusion, that we use them. So it's not, our work is not just theory based, or our tools are not theory based in that way. So these are two methodological view in our morphology description, taken as attitude of skeptical realism, and anything goes. So in this part we talk about four belief and four background. Languages differ from one another. This is the first one. The second one is the language with a small l is different from language with capital L. The third one is morphology is a distinct component of language or grammar, and the last one is morphology is our system. And we have two methodology, take an attitude of skeptical realism, and anything goes. This is the beliefs and the methodology to the morphology. The next phenomena which I want to talk about is introduction to morphological analysis. What is analysis? Two basic approaches: analysis and synthesis. There are two complementary approaches to morphology: analytic and synthetic. The linguist needs both. The analytic approach has to do with breaking words down, and it is usually associated with American structural linguistics of the first half of the 20th century. There is a good reason for this. These linguists were often dealing with languages that they had never encountered before, and there were no written grammars of these languages to guide them. It was therefore crucial that they should have very explicit methods of linguistic analysis. No matter what language we are looking at, we need analytic methods that are independent of the structures we are examining. Preconceived notions might therefore might interfere with an objective scientific analysis. This is especially true when dealing with unfamiliar languages. So this kind of approach, analysis, deals with unfamiliar languages. The second approach, synthesis, to morphology is more often associated with theory than methodology, perhaps unfairly. This is the synthetic approach. It basically says, I have a lot of little pieces here. How do I put them together? This question presupposes that you already know what the pieces are. Analysis must in some way precede synthesis. Say that you have broken a clock, for example, and taken it apart, and now you have to put all the little pieces back together. There is a catch. You don't know how. You could always, go by trial and error. But the most efficient way would be to have some theory of how the clock goes together. Synthesis really involves theory construction. From a morphological point of view, the synthetic question you ask is, how does a speaker of a language produce a grammatically complex word when needed? This question already assumes that you know what kind of elementary pieces you are making the complex word out of. We think that one of the real problems of a morphological theory is that we do not always have a good idea what the pieces are. Syntacticians can supply us with some tools, for example, case, number. These are the tools for syntacticians. We have described analysis and synthesis in terms of the morphologists studying language, but the two notions are equally applicable to speakers of a language. Speakers apply morphological analysis when they read or hear a complex word they have never encountered before. In order to understand it, they pull it apart and ask themselves whether they recognize any of the pieces. Speakers use synthesis whenever they create new forms from pre-existing pieces. So we have two approaches here, analysis and synthesis. As I told you, analysis is used for unfamiliar languages because we should break down the parts and analyze them, and synthesis is for familiar languages because we use pre-existing pieces which are familiar for us, like the clock example as I told you. So this is two approaches to morphology, which morphologists needs both of them, both analysis and the synthesis, and use them in realizing the morphological parts. So in as you know, one of this approach is analysis. So in this part I want to talk about some analytic principles. Okay, so before we try out some problems, because I told you there are some problems, we would like to give you some basic analytic principles used in morphology. They are taken from NIDA's textbook Morphology. These principles belongs to NIDA. We have four principles from NIDA, which I want to talk about. These four principles of analytic as analytic principles. Principle number one: forms with the same meaning and the same sound shape in all the occurrences are instances of the same morpheme. So step one in morphological analysis is to look for elements that have the same form and the same meaning. This is the basic type token problem. Let's say that we have a bunch of coins, for example. Each is a token, a form. If you look at them carefully, we see that three of them look very much the same. For example, they are they're composed of same material, and two of them are identical. For example, they both say 1997. These two coins are tokens of exactly the same type. So they have identical form and identical values. We may further say that the three coins are all tokens of a larger type that includes all, for example, from iron, for example, not just those minted in 1997. But so we call them same because they form are the same and they have identical values. To apply this distinction between types and tokens to the morphological analysis of words, consider, for example, the Spanish word buenísimo. Look at this example. It means very good. Buen means good, and riquísimo, very delicious again. You see, or utilissimo, for example, very useful. You see here, in each case, the suffix isimo, you see, isimo is identical in these three words in Spanish. Isimo contributes the same superlative meaning, and it has the same shape, isimo, it means very. We logically conclude that the suffix is the same for all these three words Note that we presented 3 words, all with the same suffix, isimo. It is not enough to look at one form when attempting to break it up into, its smaller parts. One thing that makes a morpheme is that it recurs. We should have more than 1, 2, 3, or 4 words to to conclude about the morphemes, and thus speakers are able to identify it and give it a meaning. So this is the principle number 1: forms with the same meaning and the same sound shape in all the occurrences or instances of the same morphemes, like the coins, and like this example from Spanish. You can find the same examples from your language, Arabic language, to find the first principle of NIDA's analytic principle. Okay, this is the first one. I want to talk about the second principle. Look at the second principle: forms with the same meaning but different sound. Okay, excuse me. Forms with the same meaning but different sound shapes may be instances of the same morpheme if their distribution do not overlap. This is the second principle of our NIDA's principle. In quad modula, so the second one, excuse me, forms with the same meaning but different sound shapes may be instances of the same morphemes if their distribution do not overlap. In quad modula, the stem Baj, for example, has 2 possible shapes in this language, Baj and Bej, but their distributions do not overlap. Bej occurs in the presence of a morpheme with an underlying tense vowel, but Baj does not. This non-overlapping distribution allows us to conclude that the 2 forms are instances of the same morpheme. When 2 or more instances of a given morpheme occur with different shapes, we call them allomorphs. Okay, allomorphs were introduced in the previous section as I talk about the Z as a plural. Okay, so this is the principle 2. Look at the example. The regular plural markers in English has several, for example, allomorphs. Voiceless allomorphs, sits, voiced alveolar fricative z, shades, and the schwa plus voiced alveolar fricative z, like hedges, and syllabic alveolar nasal, oxen, and the empty one, fish. Look at these. We call them allomorphs of regular plural markers in English. Okay, so this is, as in the previous example, you see the distribution of these forms do not overlap and they all have the same meaning. We can infer that they are instances of the same morpheme. So we call it principle number 2. Again, I read it: forms with the same meaning but different sound shapes, like these ones, z, z, n, and empty, may be instances of the same morpheme. They are instances of the same morpheme, the plural z. Okay, if the distribution do not overlap. When we use s, we cannot use z and the other part. So they are the allomorphs of the same morpheme, which I call it the plural morpheme in English language. These are 2 principles of NIDA's principles about analytic analysis. So in this session, I talked about, I talked about 2 approaches to morphology. analysis and synthesis. And in the last part, I talked about two principles of NIDA's analytic approach, principle number 1 and principle number 2. In the next session, I will talk about the other two principles of NIDA's analytic approach. And again, in this, chapter, I talked about some beliefs in which we use in this book. So in the next session, I talked about the other principles of NIDA's and some problems in the morphological analysis. So I think that's enough for today, and thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.